And so, with nothing else to tell us any better, and armed with the knowledge that these records may be imperfect, we must start with the records made in the Books of Sorrow, not at Earth, but on a distant shadowed world called Fundament. Fundament was a gas giant, one so massive that its gravity could pull other planets down beneath its clouds where they would impact on its surface oceans. The remains of these planets would form into continents, and on these continents, life of a sort would struggle to carve out an existence. The smallest form of life on Fundament was that of the Krill, and they were constantly under threat from the harsh world upon which they lived. There were many nations of Krill, and one such nation was the Osmium Court, and their king, its ruler, was about to be put through dire straits. Their king was 10, a long and withering existence for the short-lived Krill, save for their mother spawn who lived significantly longer. The king of the court had 3 offspring: Shiro, the youngest, who aspired to the ways of combat so she might seek adventure and defend her people; Sathona, the wisest, one who wished to consume the royal jelly and become a long-lived mother so that she could learn all of the secrets of the world; and ORyx, the eldest, she who was to become the next ruler of the Osmium Court, she who was to take the king morph and to replace her aging father. Though they could not possibly know it, these 3 siblings would change the universe forever, and would be led down a path of destruction so great that it would shake the foundations of reality itself. But this all began with their father's assassination. Their father was senile at the time. Most Krill who were long-lived would die at the age of 8, but at 10 years old the king was being driven to madness. But to some, it was evident that there was at least some method in his madness. He would study the sky, raving of moons above Fundament's eternal storm clouds, and always he was accompanied by his familiar, a white worm-like thing that was dead but had washed up from the sea depths. In a state of despondence and in response to the king's consistent madness, Teox, a mother of the Osmium Court, wrote to their arch-enemies, the Helium Drinkers, begging for them to kill the king of the Osmium Court and to slay his 3 offspring, offering to rule as a regent for them beneath their command in his stead. The Helium Drinkers happily accepted and slew the Osmium King, but they were not fast enough to slay his progeny. Shiro, Sathona, and ORyx fled with their father's familiar and took a ship out onto the great oceans of Fundament. Upon its mast, they swore in blood that in their lifetimes they would return to the Osmium Court and avenge their father, kill Teox and the Helium Drinkers, and understand the doom that their father spoke of as he raved in what many believed to be madness, but the sisters were slowly starting to realize might well be something to be concerned of. The doom that their father spoke of was later divined by ORyx, who remembered the last words that her father had said to her, namely, that the moons were different and that the laws were bent. He made a sign representing a syzygy, and it was this that revealed to ORyx the nature of their doom. In the skies above Fundament, there were 52 moons in orbit, but if all of them fell into the correct alignment, they would pull in the same direction all at once, and they would therefore pull the vast waters of Fundament's oceans into a massive bulge beneath where they lay. When the combined force of their gravitational pull passed, the mass of water would then be dispersed in all directions, in the form of a tidal wave that would swallow whole civilizations, a god wave. Their quest was now even more urgent. Shiro, Sathona, and ORyx needed to not only defeat the traitors, but to save their world and their people from extinction. In their extended travels, they found a great crashed ship, an artifact of a bygone era, an artifact of a greater civilization. This was not necessarily a seafaring ship, it was potentially a spacefaring one. It was the Needle, and they had only found it thanks to the whispering of their father's worm, which was now held by Sathona. The dead familiar that the king had always brought with him was apparently able to communicate with her, and with its advice, they held onto the Needle instead of selling it. They then took a further 2 years not only to repair the ship's systems, but also to deeply understand them. But as 2 years passed, Sathona grew worried. She believed that they would not have the time they needed to see the dream of their vengeance realized. It is then that ORyx stated that they should dive. They had long since learned that they could use the ship to chart the immeasurable depths of Fundament's oceans, and ORyx believed that below the waves, closer to the planet's core, they might find answers. Shiro protested, remembering the bodies of the ship's prior owners and how something from down in the deeps had clearly caused their ruin. But Savathun, who had heard the worm familiar whisper to her of the plan's brilliance, agreed with ORyx. And so, the descent began. Through the crushing depths and past terrifying beasts, the siblings ventured until they came to a still place. Here, they monitored the waves above, and the sensors of the ship stated that their fears of a Syzygy were indeed true. It was indeed coming to pass, and it was at that moment that they encountered the Leviathan, a creature as massive as the continents of their childhood, and it spoke to them, urging them to turn away from the depths of Fundament and from the deep itself. The Leviathan's voice was booming inside their heads, massive, forceful, and determined at first. But when finally it was exhausted by the protests of ORyx and Shiro, Sathona would state that they should dive. Her justification was completely clear at this point. She stated that she was guided by her father's familiar, and that this was what had given them hope, whilst the Leviathan merely wished for them to return to the surface of Fundament to live short lives and die. And so they continued to dive deeper, down into the crushing depths of Fundament's core. And down in those depths, ORyx found herself standing unprotected on the hull of the ship. But in spite of the immense pressure and heat, she was unharmed. Before her there were 5 massive creatures. They were the worm gods: Yul the honest worm, Zol the will of thousands, the ever-hunger, Ayr the keeper of order, and Akka the worm of secrets. Ancient creatures that served the deep, or as we now know it, the darkness. Yul offered ORyx and her sisters a bargain, and told them that the worm gods had been trapped in Fundament's core for eons by the Leviathan. Their bargain was simple. They would be granted immortal life by consuming the children of the worm gods, but they had to always obey their nature as beings. Shiro would be perpetually attempting to test her strength, Sathona her cunning, and ORyx her knowledge of the universe and her explorations of it. The sisters accepted the bargain, and took the worm god's larvae back to the surface once they had all chosen new morphs and new names. Shiro, Sathona, and ORyx ceased to be, and with that, the birth of the ascendant Hive gods Xivu-Arath, Savathun, and ORyx was complete, with Xivu-Arath taking up the Night Morph, Savathun taking up the Mother Morph, and ORyx the King Morph. They rose again to the surface of Fundament, feeding the worm god's children to any krill that would follow them, and killing the rest. The war they brought to the surface eventually engulfed all of Fundament, with the survivors falling back to Kahan Atoll. The worm gods eventually rose to the surface with them, and escaped Fundament with the forces of the sisters. They pursued Teox, the sterile mother who had betrayed the Osmium dynasty to one of Fundament's icy moons. On that moon, the worm gods discovered that there was another race inhabiting it, known as the Ammonite, and that there was also a 53rd moon hanging above its orbit, although technically this was not a moon at all. It was a divine presence of the deep's polar opposite. It was a presence of the sky, or the light as we better know it. And what was this presence? The Traveler. The Krill and the Worm Gods undertook a campaign of annihilation against the Ammonite, Teox and the Traveler, and whilst Teox would escape during the campaign, the siblings of the Osmium dynasty, especially ORyx, learned of the ways of the sword logic and embraced a dark power, making them even more terrifying and giving Teox good reason to flee. During the war, though, ORyx was struck with ideals of pacifism, which enraged the Worm Gods. They believed in the ideals of the sword logic, that life should be tested against life, that only the strong should remain. The worm that ORyx had consumed in the depths of Fundament yearned for war, and eventually, this hunger was starting to gnaw at his soul and led him back into the fray. But even after this, he still offered to parley with the Ammonite on neutral ground. It was then that the Worm Gods demanded Savathun teach him, and teach him she did. She betrayed ORyx. She killed him. But ORyx did not die. Instead, he awoke in his throne world, a part of the Ascendant Realms, an alternate dimension where the Hive Ascendants go when they die. It is only in this Ascendant Realm that he could truly be killed. And whilst ORyx was recovering, Savathun went to the neutral ground and poisoned it, killing the representatives of the Ammonite that were meant to meet at the point to parley for peace. Before the war was won, the Leviathan came forth from the depths of Fundament, and was slain by the forces of the deep in a final battle of Fundament's moons that shook the worlds to their core. After burrowing out of the worlds they'd conquered and multiplying at a great pace, the Krill would take up a new name as a species and would be referred to from this moment until time ended as the Hive. They strengthened their resolve and battled each other for over 20,000 years, and then, at last, they set out stronger, and they set out on a campaign of genocide across the universe, fighting many different species and bringing all of them to their end, finding them unworthy of the sword logic's challenge, the test that states life should exist with strength. However, they encountered a problem, as ORyx discovered that the more they fought, the more the hunger of their worms expanded, and so they faced the threat that they would not be able to satisfy their worms' insatiable hunger. This put the supposed immortality that the Worm Gods had offered them into context, but beyond just this, it set the stage for a greater threat that was looming on the horizon. An alien empire known as the Ecumene came to face the power of the siblings. They had diverted all their resources into a campaign of utter annihilation against the Hive, responding with overwhelming force whenever ORyx, Savathun, or Xivu-Arath appeared. They knew exactly how to defeat the Hive, and this was no coincidence, because they were being guided in that method of destruction by Teox, the traitor mother. Eventually, the siblings were beaten back so much that they were left with no strength to go on fighting. They gathered in ORyx's throne world and assessed their options. Whilst Xivu-Arath wanted to retreat and gather strength, and Savathun wanted to beg the Worm Gods for more power, at this point, ORyx knew the logic of the sword better than them both, and knew that they needed to aggressively proclaim their right to exist through war and death. As this truth was affirmed, a plan of action was devised. In this plan, ORyx slew his two sisters, and by the sword logic, became more powerful by proving his might over them. With their true deaths under his wing, ORyx went to Akka, the worm god of secrets, and told him that he wished to receive the secrets of the deep. When Akka said he gave no secrets, ORyx rebuffed the worm god and stated that giving was for the sky and that he had to take what he wanted, even if it meant killing Akka, even though Akka was his god. And so ORyx slew Akka the worm god, and from his ruin he pulled the secret of communing with the deep. He recorded that secret on a series of tablets known as the Tablets of Ruin and hung them about his waist. Following this, he used the secret to enter the deep itself, and whilst his speech with the deep was not recorded, what is known as this: when he emerged from the deep, he pronounced that he was ORyx no longer. Instead, he was ORyx, the Taken King, and that he had the power to take life and make it his own. It was at this moment that ORyx went out into the universe and unleashed his new powers upon the Ecumene forces, namely his new ability to take, which allowed him to abduct his enemies, corrupt them with darkness, and return them as compliant slaves bound to his will and given new abilities thanks to the power of the sword logic. It was too much for the Ecumene, and eventually they were pushed back and slaughtered. It is here that ORyx enacted two peculiar Hive resurrections. In spite of their deaths being true, both Xivu-Arath and Savathun were returned to life, each of them respectively summoned back with war and trickery. The Ecumene were eradicated so completely after this that only in the Books of Sorrow and in the mind of Teox, who yet again had evaded their capture, were they even remembered. All note of them, all memory, all trace was wiped from the universe. Following this, ORyx would have moments and time to commune with the darkness thanks to the rituals recorded on the Tablets of Ruin, and the darkness would show him terrible dreamlike hallucinations, replicating his childhood and teaching him to be yet more brutal, to embrace the sword logic even further. ORyx also learned that Xivu-Arath and Savathun were at this moment conspiring to leave him stranded on his expedition into the deep. Despite this, he was brought back, and when he was brought back, he endeavored to bring sons and daughters into this world so that he might love and kill them, so that all would be empowered and strengthened. The first of these children was Crota, the Eater of Hope, whose strength was unparalleled and who would one day rise to be one of the greatest champions of the Hive. The second was Nokris, who was feeble in strength but strong in mind, more of a wizard than a knight, unlike his demon brother. The third and fourth of his children came from a single larvae, cleft in two by ORyx's great sword Willbreaker. The larvae became the twin daughters of ORyx, the death singers Uranuk, the Weaver, and Halak, the Unraveler. ORyx's children accomplished many great deeds, and their stories were numerous. From the creation of the Death Song to the destruction of whole axioms of the universe, ORyx's daughters, in particular, were highly accomplished. One day, they were cutting a wound in reality, and were proceeding to die inside it. When ORyx inquired as to why, they stated that they would seek to create an oversoul as a way of both hiding their deaths as well as creating a death impulse capable of defending their throne worlds if needs be. ORyx told Crota that he should observe his sisters and try to learn cunning from them, and so Crota too decided that he should experiment with a wound in reality. However, when Crota tore open a wound in reality, it was thanks to Savathun, who had manipulated the wound, that a partially mechanical form of life poured forth from it, a race known as the Vex. The exact origins of the Vex and the nature of their power is shrouded in a fair deal of mystery, but they spilled forth from the breach and began to invade ORyx's throne world. Before Crota could respond by destroying them all, a Vex mind manifested known as Quria Blade Transform, which deduced the sword logic. With this knowledge of the particular universe in which they stood at their hand, the Vex began to slaughter ORyx's thrall and acolyte, and by right of conquest and slaughter, had gained a foothold and presence within ORyx's throne world as they invaded it with force, obeying the logic of the new space that they had found. In spite of Uranuk and Halak pulling sword stars from the sky and creating devices known as the Annihilator Totems to stop them, the Vex would press forth unabated. It was only as Quria abducted the children of the worm gods and discovered that by praising them it could gain even more power that the worm god Aya stepped in, telling ORyx to set his house in order. ORyx returned home and slew the Vex invaders, pushing them and Quria back. As punishment, he took Crota and threw him into the Vex Gate network, saying, "Come home glorious, or die forgotten." Crota would accomplish this, going on to be a legendary demon of the Hive, tearing down his opponents and allowing only a few to survive to tell of the wrath of the Osmium dynasty. But even though Crota had succeeded, there was still a problem, because ORyx's throne world was now left with a tear inside it, a tear that left him weak to a counterattack, or potentially sabotage by one of his sisters. And so, before his court he declared that they would transform his throne world, his part of the Ascendant Plane, into a physical ship in the material world. This was the Dreadnought, and it was built not only from parts of Akka's corpse, but with the incredibly terrifying, mind-bending power of ORyx and his Hive. His court worked in tandem to create what was effectively a paradox, a throne world of the Ascendant Plane pushed into physical space, a screaming, gaping hole in what would be reality. But regardless, ORyx's power was so incredible that even breaking the laws of physics themselves was nothing towards his might. With this accomplished, ORyx's throne world was secure, and now was time to deal with Quria. He used his dreadnought to attack a flotilla of ships that was guiding the Nightshare Thought Ship, a great vessel that he believed contained the location of a place of immense light, known as the Gift Mast. When he boarded the ship, he found Quria and squarely defeated it, even as Quria tried to simulate him and his power. Quria was taken, and ORyx presented its remains to Savathun with but a single change from the typical beings of the Taken, namely, that it had a small fragment of its independence still left, and it was not completely bound to the will of its controller. From here, the Hive took their time and prepared to make an assault on the Gift Mast, which they had now found. The civilization surrounding this great place of light had been passed over by the Traveler, which had altered the gravity of a black hole so that the worlds around it might not be devoured, and would instead flourish within its now altered accretion disk. They would be provided warmth and sustenance, and their civilization would grow, and as a monument to the light, the Traveler erected a Gift Mast, a great spear-like structure that jutted from the black hole and was filled with the power of the light. A gleaming monument rising forth from a singularity, filled with the energies of life itself. The Hive wished to devour this light, and as the Deep was moving in this direction to devour the whole system, so too would the Hive naturally be its vanguard. They marched upon the Wishmast, killing the Harmony, its occupants, and the Ahamkara, the great dragons that lived among them. But as the Gift Mask was being devoured by ORyx's brood, and as his victory was certain, Savathun departed her brother, saying that they needed to grow distant from each other. She took her moons and her brood, and they fell into the black hole that the Harmony lived around, never to be heard from again. In the same stroke, Shiva Wrath took her broods and war moons and fled into the night with a similar purpose. Both of their throne worlds became distant and inaccessible to ORyx, and he was left to ponder. It was here that ORyx reaffirmed his choices and his belief in the darkness, but ORyx also pondered the question of what should happen if he should die. He surmised that the one who killed him should be the one who understood the universe in a more complete manner than him, and he believed that he would only be killed by something mighty, something that had some greater knowledge of the sword logic, perhaps, or perhaps with some clever trap. He therefore decided to lay out a means by which he might survive, even if he was destroyed. Within the Books of Sorrow, he created a map to a weapon that exemplified everything that he was, that in a certain way was him if created. And a being that wielded this weapon and used it to become mightier than both of them would be ORyx living on, and ORyx deduced that they would become one and the same, a means by which he could truly become immortal even beyond a true death. This weapon would not see construction for generations, but when it was, it would be a weapon of malice, and we would be the ones to construct it.